everybody. Welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Thursday, the 9th, where we are talking about Frankenstein. Though I wanted to back up a little bit. If you'll see the notes below, I have some links that might be of interest to you. The first is a booklet that I actually found in a New Jersey antique store years ago entitled, Is College Bad for Girls? And it's a picture of a medical appointment pamphlet from 1906 arguing that college is bad for girls. If you've ever heard the expression that a picture is worth 1,000 words, then I think I will just stop it here and let you look at that picture. And also on Darwin's Origin of Species, 1859, just a small section, not the entire thing, about female inferiority that occurred according to some of Darwin's theories because of their ability to reproduce. Then in 1923, a teacher's contract about some of the rules for a teacher. 1950s, the Good Wives Guide. There's been some controversy about some of these pieces that perhaps they may not be totally accurate, but the sentiment is accurate. And 5 things women could not do in the 1960s. And I can say that I was born in the late 1960s. Lastly, there is a documentary, and I don't expect you to watch it. It's 2 hours long, but if you're interested in the subject, Killing Us Softly Then and Now. Jean Kilbourne is a noted feminist scholar who started in the 1970s by using magazine images to talk a little bit about some of the overt and covert messages about female in society. And she's basically just about every decade or so updated her documentary to show how things have changed, but more troubling, how things have remained the same. And this is from the Media Education Foundation, which is housed out of Northampton. And I know that oftentimes her documentaries are shown in sociology classes and also in psychology classes. In 2019, at Smith College, there was a panel discussion about her work. That's what I've posted for you to be able to see. That's 2 hours long with some noted media theorists, including Jackson Katz. If you know anything about media studies, then you might know some of his work, which is similar to Jean Kilbourne's, but instead of focusing on the female, he focuses on the male. Perhaps his most famous work is a documentary called Tough Guys, Guise, with a play on the word guys, Guys, and that men are conditioned to present this tough guys in media, and that it comes to the detriment of their being able to have authentic expression of emotion. So if you're interested in the subject, certainly you can watch some or all of this documentary or panel discussion, and the GCC library houses the documentaries as well if you wanted to see either Tough Guys or you wanted to see Killing Us Softly or both. And if you will look at the notes below, under our second section is paper topics. And I have posted our suggested paper topics in the syllabus and other documents folder. And I recommend that you might want to take a print copy just so that you can reference that. And both papers are similar. Paper number 1, which is due approximately midway through the semester, deliberately so, and paper number 2, which is due towards the ending of the semester, are both critical papers, so you shouldn't be consulting outside resources. And you should be using the learning that you've experienced in class. Paper length, approximately 4 to 5 pages, but approximately is approximately as long or as short as it needs to be for you to defend your thesis. And what I've done is I've selected a topic based on a quote that was in The Cult of True Womanhood, which is how we began this semester, that I think is quite appropriate for our class. That's not to say that you can't write on your own topic. But if you do decide to write on your own topic, you have to have the topic approved by me. And For your first paper, you would be addressing one of the earlier readings in the semester. So thus far, we've talked about The Story of an Hour. We're in the midst of talking about Frankenstein, and we will move after Frankenstein into Persuasion. Paper number 2, which is a similar exercise to paper number 1, would be dealing with the later texts in the semester, which would be either Jane Eyre, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, or The Awakening. Notice that I didn't list Dickinson. We will be discussing over the course of the semester. Dickinson is a little bit different because Dickinson is poetry rather than short story or novel. That's not to say that you can't write on Dickinson. It's certainly an option, and as the semester progresses, we can talk a little bit more about that after we talk about Dickinson in our course outline reading list. But for now, we are talking about Frankenstein, and if you will remember the topic question that I selected from The Cult of True Womanhood, quote, girls could be ruined by a book which attacked or seemed to attack a woman's accepted place in society, unquote. And how does that quote relate to the text or text you selected for your paper? It is possible to talk about more than one text, but I caution you that when you are talking about more than one text, you don't want to take a topic that's so broad that you really have difficulty writing a thorough analysis in the 4 to 5 page suggested length. So you need to make sure that you are limiting your topics. And of course, when we talked about The Story of an Hour, you could see how the suggestion that a woman who has a kind, loving husband, after all, he had kind hands, and he looked saved, not but with love upon her. And she did love him, albeit sometimes. How a woman in that kind of marriage might be unfulfilled, so much so that she could actually revel in the idea of widowhood. And of course, the twist in the story is that it turns out that her husband, Brentley Mallard, was given a first name. Unlike her, Mrs. Mallard, not until later in the story, when she believes she's a widow, is she referred to by her first name, Louise, which has a male root to it, Louis, illustrating the idea of the focus on the male in this time period in society. When she sees her husband is alive, she dies of joy that kills. And we are told that she has heart disease at the ending of the story, but at the beginning of the story, we're told she has heart trouble. Those are two very different things. A troubled heart, an emotional issue, as opposed to heart disease, a physical issue. And those around her assume that she succumbs to the physical heart disease because of the shock of seeing her husband alive and the joy of his return. And yes, she did love him sometimes, but we're privy to knowledge that the other characters are not, because we spent time alone with Mrs. Mallard in her room, and we saw how she was beginning to contemplate the possibility of freedom and living for herself. So we also know that Joy That Kills is ironic because she's now lost the opportunity to have freedom within the institution of marriage because her husband is alive. So now we move to Frankenstein, and I had you last week watch the very iconic 1930s Universal Studios version of Frankenstein, which, as I had suggested to you, is a very different story than what Mary Shelley presented in her text. And I view them as two distinct separate stories. Certainly from a cultural perspective, the film is probably what has had the most influence. And even though the film is different than the text, I still think that we get a portrayal in the film versions of the creature. Notice I do not call him the monster, because the true monster really is Victor and humanity as a whole in Shelley's text. Just to complicate matters, in the film, we've got name switches. So Victor is Henry and Henry is Victor. And the best explanation I can come up with is that, considering the time period of the film, Victor is a seemingly very German name, and of course this was a very delicate time with Germany, so perhaps not the best idea to put our male central character with the name of Victor, so it's changed to Henry. But of course in the text our central character is indeed Victor. But It's the creator of the creature and humanity as a whole who rejects this creature that really is the true monstrosity. And I think that the actor who plays the creature in the Universal Studios film version, Boris Karloff, gives us a rather sympathetic childlike portrayal. Some of the scenes, I can't help but think of the drowning scene of the girl, obviously is different in the text than what we get in the film. But the sentiment is the same, is that the creature really is naive and innocent and is not malicious, which is one of the messages that Shelley gives us. And the beginning of the film I always find to be fascinating because it's based on a story by Mrs. Percy Shelley, which I think says everything about the way gender was viewed, not only during Shelley's time, but also during the time of the film, the 1930s. And we know that Mary Shelley was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, a noted feminist critic. And we know that the piece was written as part of a horror story competition when Mary Shelley was vacationing with Percy and some of their friends and experienced inclement weather. And we know that the very famous creation scene in chapter 5 of the text is a nightmare that Mary Shelley had during that ghost story competition that inspired her to write the text. We know that Percy Shelley, the great noted romantic poet, edited the text and suggested that she lengthen it, which she did. And in part, what she did was she added these long scenes about the natural world, which was not an unusual approach during the time period known as the Romantic period, when authors were giving long descriptions of nature and the natural world and drawing parallels with the human world. These descriptions might seem to be fluff, but I would argue they're not, and for a twofold reason. The first being that one of the messages embedded within Mary Shelley's text is about the healing nature of nature, and the idea that the natural world is a feminine force is one of the ways that I think we can read this text, which on the surface seems incredibly male centric and might not seem to be necessarily applicable to the quote that I had selected from The Cult of True Womanhood. But I would argue that if nature is indeed feminine and nature in that instance could be viewed as our central character, and when one disregards or in one way or another rejects nature, the consequences are dire. And in a male centric text that has basically very few females, we could say the same thing, that the females who are rejected by the central male characters are the possible salvation for these male characters. That their hubris, their excessive ambition, their lack of acknowledgement of guilt, all of these are the consequences of isolating female in society and not giving female voice. So if you read the text from that perspective, it's a rather progressive text. And we know that certainly that the Frankenstein text has never been out of print. So as influential as the film has been, that there's something about the story Frankenstein that has captured the modern imagination. I've always half jokingly said that every science student needs to read Frankenstein, a cautionary tale about what happens with science run amok. And not that Mary Shelley could have anticipated things like cloning or artificial intelligence, but those seem to be very applicable in terms of some of the messages within the text, which I guess to simplify would be just because you can, that doesn't mean you should. But that said, the question of what is monstrous, and monstrare means to show or reveal in Latin, and I think this is very much a moral text that is trying to teach us something. And most people refer to this text incorrectly. We call it Frankenstein, but ultimately, the title in its whole is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. Mary Shelley was very well educated. She was very well schooled in the classics, certainly knew about Greek mythology. So if you know about Prometheus, he stole fire from the gods, gave it to humanity, and he was punished for doing that. And there are going to be a lot of parallels with our central character, both Victor and also Walton. And that's one of the major ways that the film is different from the text. There is no Walton narrative, which I'll talk a little bit about in a few moments. Also, there are other literary references within the text. Milton's Paradise Lost, for instance. And as good as the text is, that's not to say that Mary Shelley, who was quite young when she wrote it, didn't necessarily have some awkward places in the text. One of my favorites is when the creature happens to be wandering in the forest or the wilderness and happens to find a satchel of books. And within that satchel happens to be great literary text such as Paradise Lost. I dare any of you to see if you can find some of your English books just lying in a satchel in the forest so that you don't have to buy them in the bookstore. And in an even greater suspension of disbelief, we have to believe that the creature has the ability to teach itself how to read and how to speak, just by observing a family that is teaching English to someone who is not fluent in English as a first language. Knowing a little bit about that great epic poem by Milton, Paradise Lost, can be very helpful. It is the biblical story or the dramatization in poetic form it's an epic poem, of the biblical story of Adam and Eve being tempted out of paradise through the devil. And we get devil's story in this epic poem. And one of the ways that this text is rather unusual is that it portrays Satan from a rather sympathetic perspective. That Satan, if you know the story, was created as the brightest of angels, but then ignored by God when the newest or newer creation of humanity occurred. Of course, the story is more complicated than that. But nevertheless, Satan comes off as a rather sympathetic character. And the fact that a creation is abandoned by its creator is definitely applicable to the story of Frankenstein. And also the idea that creation doesn't ask to be created. None of us asked to be created from our parents. So there are a lot of parallels with parent-child relationships, particularly challenging parent and child relationships in the novel Frankenstein. And this sense of Paradise Lost is also reflected in another great literary piece entitled Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare's. And basically, the story of Dr. Faustus, based on the German Faust myth, is there was a scholar who sold his soul to the devil for infinite knowledge because the scholar had already achieved all knowledge. And well, first of all, the devil doesn't really offer much, but one wouldn't expect the devil to offer much, now would one? But secondly, and more importantly, is that Faustus spends his time initially saying that he wants to do good with all of this additional knowledge, such as making men live eternally, and instead he squanders away his time by playing pranks, and such as making himself invisible and scaring the Pope during religious services. And throughout the play, Faustus vacillates, talking about either that he's so evil that he can't be forgiven even by God, so he may as well enjoy his earthly life, or that God will forgive him, but he still has time to repent, so in the interim, he can enjoy his worldly life. The play ends with Faustus being dragged kicking and screaming into hell as the ending of his time has elapsed, and now it's come to the point where the devil is going to collect his soul. At that point, Faustus repents. Too little, too late. And this too is a cautionary tale about excessive hubris. There is this idea of the knowledge that is forbidden, that if one pursues, there will be negative consequences. We saw that with Prometheus. We see it with Dr. Faustus. We will see it with Victor Frankenstein in the text. And we will also see it with our narrator, who happens to be Walton, a ship captain who is searching for undiscovered territory in the Arctic, which I'll get back to a little bit later. But the idea that this is a morality tale, and it's a story that can be examined in science fiction classes, because there is this element of the ability of science to be able to create life from death, but we just haven't gotten to that point yet, which is what science fiction is that it's a scientific possibility, but we haven't necessarily come to the point where that possibility has been formed into a reality. But it also is addressed in Gothic literature and in supernatural literature classes, which is what I do, because there are supernatural references. Cornelius Agrippa is a very famous occultist, and the idea that a life can be created from death, some might say, is a scientific impossibility unless there is some supernatural intervention. And at one point in Frankenstein, and we talk about the Philosopher's Stone, which you might be familiar with from Harry Potter lore. The idea of the Philosopher's Stone is supposed to give everlasting life. So there is that supernatural element, and there certainly is a dark Gothic element, a horror element within it. We don't get a lot of details of Victor searching the charnel houses and graves for his dead bodies, but certainly it's quite macabre. And the very famous creation scene that's set in A Dreary Night in November is very Gothic. And in the Gothic tradition, it basically is about a setting that's eerie. The idea of some sort of a structure, such as a castle or a large home that has Gothic architecture associated with it, huge spires, for instance. You might want to think about Gothic cathedrals. And it's in disrepair and decay. There are possible supernatural elements. There is ambiguity. So if you wanted to grasp a naturalistic explanation, you could. There's a heroine who's in distress, and usually some sort of male savior. And we see elements of this in Frankenstein. We'll also see elements of this in Jane Eyre, which is another text that we will be reading over the course of the semester. Now, that said, if you want to think about Victor's motivations, perhaps it has something to do with the loss of his mother, which I think is quite ironic, because at the beginning of the book, Victor talks about his close relationship with his parents. And yet, of course, Victor is not able to duplicate that with his own creation. And also the idea that he views Elizabeth as an object, which would not be unusual at the time period, that a female was basically property. And of course, the argument is that if he had pursued a relationship with Elizabeth earlier rather than pursuing the dark arts and his scientific discoveries, he wouldn't have gone down this path of descent and decay. Elizabeth, much like in the Cult of True Womanhood, could have served as a kind of savior for Victor. Though there are other characters in the novel, and I'm hopeful at this point that you have finished the novel and that you are on your way to reading Persuasion. But we won't finish the novel today. We'll talk about it a little bit next class and then begin talking about Persuasion. So hopefully I won't be giving away too many spoilers when it comes to the novel. But there are other female characters. One is named Justine, and she basically admits to a crime. She confesses to a crime that she never committed because she has fear of excommunication. And again, think about the Cult of True Womanhood and the importance of purity, and so much so that a woman could be intimidated by church elders to admit to something that she didn't do just so that she could save her soul. And we also have another female character named Safie. Notice these are not characters in the Hollywood movie. And Safie basically sets out on her own to find her true love. A rather bold move for a female during the time period. This is part of the DeLacy subplot, which is not included in the film. The film also gives us elements that would never be included in the text. There is no abnormal brain. And by the way, if you've never seen Young Frankenstein, it is hilarious, and I do recommend it. And they talk about abnormal, which is in reference to the abnormal brain. And there is no Fritz character, which is kind of like the Igor character that's become cliche in the Gothic tradition. But that said, I think we can get through both the film and the text this question of what is monstrous. And ultimately, in the end, humanity is much more monstrous than the creature could ever be. If you've ever heard of the old philosophical argument of nature versus nurture, and when we get the creature story, it seems that the creature is born benevolent. And it's only through experiences with humans that it learns to be malevolent, which leads to some contemporary day questions that how much can we blame, for instance, our environment for our actions? And we can up until a point, but at some point we have to take responsibility as well. So there are a lot of contemporary elements within the text. But really, what I wanted to focus on, at least for this class, is the narration, which is quite important because if you miss this, you miss the complexity of the novel itself. And this is something that, again, is usually not addressed in film. We are given an introduction of letters. And these are communications between Robert Walton, the ship captain, who's searching for an undiscovered passage in the Arctic. And he's writing to his sister, Margaret. In fact, she's known as Mrs. Seville, which I think is also quite telling because she's referenced by her married name and not by her first name. I can't help but think of Mrs. Mallard in The Story of an Hour. And Walton talks about how he is lonely and isolated. And in the world of the Gothic, that's always a negative thing. And I would suggest that for us in our interpretation of the text, male centric isolation from female leads to a lot of negative consequences. That's one of the messages embedded within the text. Walton talks about how he prefers glory to every enticement that wealth places in his path. This hubris, this excessive arrogance to discover something no one has discovered, will parallel Victor when we're introduced to his character. So Walton and Victor are kind of like bookends of one another. And Walton talks about in the third letter that he is about to visit unvisited regions. That's literal and figurative because Walton is the one who's going to be giving us Victor's story. But more on that in a moment. And Walton asks in the third letter, what can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man? Of course, Victor will say the same thing, and we'll see the negative consequences of that. So Walton runs across the traveler, and as progressive as Mary Shelley might be about talking about the way that difference or the idea of other, that which is different from ourselves, tends to be rejected for no good reason outside of appearance, think about how that could be applicable to something like racism or sexism. But Shelley, too, is a product of her time period, and there is a very Eurocentric bias in her writing. And we see it initially when Walton says that he encounters a traveler in the ocean who didn't seem to be a savage inhabitant of some undiscovered island, but a European. And definitely there's this sense of the superiority of the European in this text. And Walton and Victor are talking, and Victor says that he sought for dominion that he should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race. Unhappy man, do you share my madness? So this is basically the frame for the entire story, is that Victor is going to relate to Walton Victor's story of hubris and ambition so that Walton doesn't make the same mistakes. And Victor basically says he was a slave of passion, the idea of mastery and servitude. Who's a master and who is a slave? All of this sets up Victor's story in the first chapter. But note, and don't forget, that all of this is based on letters that Walton is writing to his sister. So when we get Victor's story, we never hear from Victor directly. We hear from Walton talking about what he heard from Victor. This is problematic because there's distancing that's involved. It's almost circular, a story within a story. And quite frankly, Walton is not in good shape physically, or intellectually or emotionally. His crew is threatening mutiny. He is low on provisions. And To complicate matters even further, Walton is not transcribing the story from Victor. Instead, Walton is waiting until the ending of the day and relying on his memory so that he can retell the story. Now, I'm well aware that Victor's story, which also leads to the creature's story, is told in the I, as if it was the actual individual who is relating their piece. But this is all Walton. So if you wanted to talk about the complications associated with narrative, we have a very subjective narrator because everything is told through Walton. So we know that Walton can be sick, Walton can be deluded, Walton can be mistaken, which complicates the validity of the entire narrative. This could all be a figment of Walton's imagination, a way his subconscious is grappling with his own issues. However, even if we were to accept the fact that Walton's narrative is valid and accurate, keep in mind that Victor is telling us the creature story, and we have no guarantee that Victor's narrative is accurate, either when Victor talks about himself or talks about the creature, because Victor too is in a very bad place, physically, emotionally, and intellectually, as we find out as the story unfolds that all of those who are close to Victor have been killed, and Victor and the creature have basically been reduced to a kind of cat and mouse chase game. So when we hear from Victor, it could all be a figment of his imagination, and he could be perhaps deluded or mistaken. And when we hear from the creature, we never hear from the creature. We hear from Victor, but we never really hear from Victor. We hear from Walton. So Walton is telling us what Victor is telling us, what the creature was telling him. Narrative embedded within narrative, embedded within narrative. So there's deliberate ambiguity that is embedded within the text. I was talking about one of the elements of the Gothic is oftentimes deliberate ambiguity. So if you don't want to accept a kind of supernatural or otherworldly explanation, there is an out, so to speak, and that we get a naturalistic explanation. But all of that, of course, is deleted from Hollywood in the attempt to simplify the narrative, but it makes the story much more interesting. In fact, the first time that I had studied Frankenstein, it was in relation to the idea of the embedded narrative and the untrustworthiness of narrator. If we were, though, to accept the entire story on face value, we begin with chapter 1 with Victor's story. And if you haven't gotten to the ending of the text yet, spoiler alert, we will return to Walton and his letters. So again, that will be the frame of the story itself. But it's very easy to forget that because we've got basically a first-person narrative that's being related through Walton. And Victor says to Walton, so the idea is that Walton is saying this to his sister in letters, that Victor was his parents' plaything and their idol and something better, their child, which is what I was referencing about the idea that Victor was treated well as a child, yet is unable to treat his own creation well. And note that Victor creates without the assistance of female, which defies the natural order, which seems to be another message that's embedded within the text. The use of the term plaything, though, I think is quite relevant because it is suggestive of the idea of how Victor thinks of other human beings. They're there to satisfy his needs and wants. And that's certainly how he thinks of the creature. Victor talks about how he was introduced to Elizabeth. And this might raise a few eyebrows because he talks a little bit about how Elizabeth is much like his sister, and yet he's going to be marrying her. Note that they aren't blood relations. But when we get to Persuasion, we are going to talk about how it was not unusual to marry first cousins, for instance, so that you could keep title on property within a family. The importance of a good match. And one of the things about Persuasion that I warn you about now, it's a very slow text and it seems to be quite dense. And this is very deliberate from the author's perspective because she wants to try to mimic the lifestyle of the rich, or at least the affluent. And that's what we get in the world of persuasion. That's not to say that Victor isn't privileged. He certainly is privileged enough so that he can take time off, so that he can chase this creature. So he has the income in which to be able to do so. But we will be talking about the English gentry, which is a whole other status level when we get to persuasion. When we move forward to our next text, which is Jane Eyre, we're going to talk about the poor. So basically, we're going to see through different lenses, different demographic groups of female, and the challenges that they all shared, and some of the challenges that differed from each demographic group. So, but when Victor is introduced to Elizabeth, who is raised as his sister, but he calls her his cousin, he talks about how she was adopted. And in fact, that's a theme you're going to see throughout the entire semester. Motherless children. Not that I had planned it that way, but it is a thread that seems to run through all of these texts. And we're told that this child is adopted by Victor's family in part because she was thin and very fair, unlike the other children. Again, very Eurocentric, despite Mary Shelley's progressiveness in terms of talking about things like difference impacting behavior in a negative way. And Victor tellingly says, which will be a little bit of foreshadowing, till death she was to be mine only. And of course, Victor thinks of her as a possession, much like he thinks of his creature as a possession. And yes, Elizabeth will be killed. Elizabeth is going to be central later on in terms of Victor's desire for revenge. But in chapter 2, before we get to that, Victor was talking about how the world to him was a secret which he desired to divine. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that he desired. And again, think about Faustus or think about Prometheus if you wanted to. And chapter 4, Victor says that because of this obsession, he's shunning his fellow creatures as if he had been guilty of a crime. He oftentimes uses this language, and that seems to negate his responsibility. He vacillates. And the thing is, Victor is guilty of a crime, many crimes. Certainly, stealing corpses, creating life from death, and then abandoning the life that he creates. All of these are crimes, which he never seems to completely accept responsibility for, despite what he tells Walton, that he wants to give Walton a cautionary tale. And in chapter 5, probably the most famous scene, but we've got to wait all the way till we get to chapter 5, which means that we've gone through all of Walton's letters, the great creation scene. This is the setting of the dreary night of November. This is where I'm going to stop for now, so that we can continue on talking about the text next class and then pick up with persuasion. And I'm well aware that you all might be in different places in terms of your reading. So the discussion forum question for this class is in relation to how far you've gotten in terms of your reading. So our attendance question, which will be due by Saturday, the 11th of October. Certainly, if you need additional time, please let me know and I'll be happy to grant you an extension. And I will be catching up with your discussion forum responses over the weekend, the ones that you've done previously. But the question for this class is for you to identify an important quote in Frankenstein and why you think it's important. So based on how far you've gotten into the text, up until this point, to identify a quote, and more importantly, why you think it's important. And my suspicion is that you will all select different quotes. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, though you're certainly encouraged to. Much like in a face-to-face class, you might raise your hand and give an opinion. But what you are required to do is to respond, or is to read your classmates' responses, and ultimately my responses in turn. As I said, I'm going to be catching up with my responses to you. What you should get is a good overview of some of the major elements within Frankenstein. So I wanted to pick up with chapter 5 and that great creation scene. I wanted to talk a little bit about the creature's narrative, which is embedded within Victor's narrative, which is embedded within Walton's narrative. want to talk about the DeLacy family, which is so important for the creature's development, something that's not addressed in the film version that we've seen. I want to talk a little bit about the creature's quest for revenge and what motivates him to seek out Victor's loved ones, and then ultimately Victor's response to that and the result of the two chasing each other to the death in the Arctic. And finally, at the ending of the book, Walton's response. And again, we'll begin Persuasion next class, and I warn you that Persuasion is a dense text. Try not to become too impatient with it. If you're wondering what exactly are these people doing with their time, that's the whole point. It seems that it's filled with dinner parties and gossip. These are people who do not need to work for a living, and yet at the beginning we're told about their economic troubles, the Elliot family, and their economic troubles are different from other people's economic troubles. They do have to retrench, they have to cut back expenses, but we're not talking about not being able to eat or clothe themselves or have housing. We're talking about needing to adjust their lifestyle, but still be able to maintain their reputation, which is of utmost importance to them. So ultimately, they're trying to come up with a plan for how they're going to be able to still maintain a certain standard of living, but also pay off their debts. Our central character, Anne Elliot, is supposed to be the sympathetic member of the family that we are supposed to connect with as readers. She's not nearly as pretentious or as arrogant or as shallow as any of the other characters. That's not to say that she doesn't have elements of that within her character. Again, she is a product of her times, but she is the most progressive of all of the family members, and we see everything through her eyes. She's able to critique this system in a way that would be seen as rather progressive during the time period. And what we see is the expectation for female to marry and to marry well, to improve or at the very least maintain her socioeconomic position, and how Anne rebels against that, which could be seen as we think about the quote from The Cult of True Womanhood as a book that could ruin a girl because it attacked or seemed to attack women's accepted place in society. But more on that later. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class, putting some closure onto Frankenstein and beginning Persuasion. Take care. Bye-bye.